I have read this story of Elijah and the widow many, many times, and I looked through my books of former sermons and discovered that I've preached on it at least 4 times over the last 30 years. Needless to say, I know it pretty well. But this time around, when it showed up in the lectionary, that 3-year cycle of readings, I was struck by something that I hadn't noticed before. The story takes place in the midst of a massive drought. The prophet Elijah has spoken out against the evil king Ahab, and the king has a warrant out for Elijah's arrest. Elijah is on the lam, hiding wherever he can, when he comes across this widow. He's been wandering in the desert and no doubt presents himself as quite a sight. He's famished. So he asks the widow to give him a bite to eat. "I can't," she says. "I am down to the very last bit of food that I have. A tiny scrap of meal, a drop or 2 of oil. I'm going to cook it up, feed my son, and then die." It is as dire a situation as one can imagine. Widows in that day were usually on the very edge of existence, and in the midst of a drought, their chances of survival slim to none. It is then that Elijah says something I hadn't noticed before. It is then that he trots out that well-known phrase, "Fear not," or in a modern translation, "Do not be afraid." Now, anyone who's been around the church for any amount of time, which is most of you, is familiar with this phrase, "Fear not," or as in our translation, "Do not be afraid." It shows up with great regularity in Advent, in the season when we prepare for Christmas. We hear it in the readings where Mary and Joseph are both visited by angels who tell them of the coming birth of Jesus. Each of them is assured with the words, "Fear not." I looked up the phrase in my concordance. A concordance is a listing of literally every single word in the Bible and everywhere it appears. My concordance is this big. It's huge. I discovered when I did that this phrase, "Do not be afraid," is a very common phrase in the Scriptures. It can be found in the Old and New Testaments alike. It can be found in books ranging all the way from Genesis to Revelation. And most often, it is spoken by God or some representative of God, Jesus, a prophet, an angel. Do not be afraid. In many circumstances, these words are uttered when someone has been asked to take a risk. When someone has been asked to do something that involves putting the needs of others ahead of their own. Such is the case here. "Do not be afraid," says Elijah. "Give me a bite to eat, and God will see to it that you and your son have enough meal, enough oil to see you through the drought. They won't run out until the rains come and there are fresh crops. They'll be good to the last drop." The widow responds. She rises above her fear. Remember, this is the last little bit of food that she has, and she has a starving child. She rises above that fear and takes a risk. She mixes the meal with oil, makes a bit of bread, and feeds the hungry prophet. And then we are told the jar of meal was not emptied, and the jug of oil never failed. Fear is a powerful thing, isn't it? It can stop us dead in our tracks. Instead of looking ahead, we're constantly looking behind. When we are afraid, we become self-absorbed. When we're afraid, we worry about our own health and well-being, the heck with everybody else. We crawl into a hole of despair. We hide in a cave of concern. Worry and anxiety dominate everything we do when we're afraid. But here in this little story about a widow on the verge of death, we discover the antidote to fear. Here in this tale of a prophet on the run, we are given a way to address our anxiety. We are given an antidote. And that antidote? Faith. Faith turned into action. Faith that trusts God is at work despite outward appearances. Faith that is willing to place the needs of others ahead of our own. Many, if not most of us here, are old enough to remember the killing of Medgar Evers, the civil rights activist gunned down in Jackson, Mississippi, at the height of the civil rights movement. Hard as it may be to believe, that assassination happened 50 years ago this coming Wednesday. Medgar Evers was born in Decatur, Mississippi, July 2nd, 1925. His parents were farmers, and he grew up knowing the struggles of working the land. He was drafted the year he turned 18 and served in France and Germany during World War II. He attended Alcorn College, married Merle Wiley, and had 3 children, Daryl, Rena, and James. After school, he worked for a while as an insurance agent. At the same time, he began his involvement with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He helped boycotts which were held against gas stations which would not allow black customers to use the restrooms. He was involved in a failed attempt to gain admission to the then all-white law school at the University of Mississippi. In 1954, he became the NAACP's first field secretary in Mississippi. He worked on a variety of fronts for an end to racial discrimination. He enlarged the membership of the NAACP. He participated in protest marches and boycotts. He led voter registration drives. And he challenged the discriminatory ways that the judicial system handled black defendants. He made a visual record of violent acts committed against civil rights workers. When you go up against the system, when you challenge the status quo, you are bound to make enemies. And that's precisely what happened to Medgar Evers. In a recent interview, his widow spoke of the ever-present threat that loomed over his life. He lived, she said, being constantly aware that he could be killed. His house was firebombed. Threatening phone calls were an everyday occurrence. Once a shot came through his kitchen window, hit a wall, and then lodged itself in the refrigerator in their 3-room ranch. The bullet dent is still in that refrigerator. Things were so bad, that the Evers family even worked out an emergency procedure. They drilled over and over again so that the children would know what to do in case an attack was made against their father. Drop to the floor, get to the bathroom, hide in the tub. The risks were very real. Yet Evers had faith. Evers trusted that in the end, good would triumph over evil. The gifts of God, he once said, should be enjoyed by all the citizens of Mississippi. And he believed that that could happen, that that was a realistic goal. He believed that if he and others would rise above their fears and take the necessary risks, one day, as Dr. King would say, the dream would come true. But for that to happen, he had to place the needs of others ahead of his own need for security. Only then could he help move Mississippi and indeed America into a better future, a future with opportunity for all. It was a little after midnight on that fateful date in June. A sniper shooting from about 40 yards away gunned down Evers in his own driveway, shot him in the back, killed him in cold blood. A coward's attack. He was just 37 years old. "30 years would pass before justice was served. 30 years before Byron D. LeBeckwith, a member of Mississippi's White Citizens Council, was finally convicted of the crime and sentenced to life imprisonment. He had foolishly bragged to several people that he had killed Evers and beaten the system. But the death of Medgar Evers was one of the main factors in escalating concern around the country about civil rights. And just a year later, Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a piece of legislation that helped America move towards being a land of liberty and justice for all. And that happened. That happened only because Medgar Evers and many others were willing to rise above their fears and take the risks necessary to serve others. And that happened because of a deep-seated faith that God was at work despite outward appearances. The widow of Zarephath was frightened. Medgar Evers was frightened. And those fears could have paralyzed them. But they did not. They rose above their fears and took action. Today, Jackson's airport is named for Medgar Evers. Today, a statue stands outside the city library in his honor. Today, he is remembered as a man of honor and courage and hope. Julian Bond, a black activist from Georgia, recently spoke of the results of Evers' work. The change, he said, is enormous. I used to be afraid when I drove through Mississippi. I'm going to drive through Mississippi day after tomorrow to Alabama, he said, and I'm not afraid to go to Alabama. Fear is a powerful thing. But faith is even more powerful. And faith turned into action can turn the world upside down. It can feed hungry prophets. It can change a whole culture. It can feed your soul. It can change your whole life. Amen. There isn't a single solitary soul in this room who's not experienced fear. And some of you may be going through a fearful time right now, a time of grief, a time of loss, a time of challenge, a time of the unknown. But there is an antidote to that fear. And that antidote is faith. Trusting in the simple fact that God is truly at work, even when we can't see it, even when we can't hear it, even when we least suspect it. God is at work. Trusting in that reality will allow you to deal with your fear, acting on that reality, and moving forward to serve others will give you the strength you need to move from day to day to day. It's old and it's cliched, but it's memorable. Take your eyes off yourself, sisters and brothers, and place them on God. That will move you past fear.